The stagecoach rattled violently as it hit yet another rut in the dusty road, jarring Winifred Bauer awake with a gasp. Her bruised ribs ached sharply, and the sudden movement caused the sleeping infant in her arms to stir. She adjusted the small bundle, hushing softly until the baby settled again. Through the dirt-streaked window, she caught her first glimpse of Kearney, Nebraska, a modest collection of wooden buildings stretched along a single main street. The late afternoon sun of 1878 casting long shadows across the frontier town. "End of the line, madam," the driver called as the coach lurched to a stop outside the town's small depot. Winifred drew a deep breath, wincing at the pain it caused. 23 years old, and she'd already lived several lifetimes of hardship. The bruises on her face and arms were fading to a sickly yellow, but the ones hidden beneath her travel-worn dress remained tender to the touch. She'd fled Chicago with barely enough money for passage and the clothes on her back. The advertisement for a mail-order bride had been her salvation, or so she prayed. The driver opened the door, offering a calloused hand. "Need help with your things?" "Just this bag, thank you," she replied, careful to keep her voice steady as she indicated the small carpetbag beside her. Everything she owned in the world was contained within it, along with the few baby items she'd managed to acquire. As she stepped onto the wooden platform, baby cradled against her chest, Winifred scanned the small crowd. According to the letter, her intended husband would meet her here, Ethan Blackburn, cattle rancher. Her stomach twisted with anxiety. The letter exchange had been brief and practical. He needed a wife to help with his ranch. She needed escape. She'd never mentioned the baby. A tall figure detached from the shadow of the depot building. His face was partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but Winifred could make out a strong jaw darkened with stubble. His shoulders were broad beneath a dust-covered shirt, and his stance confident as he approached. When he removed his hat, revealing hair the color of sun-bleached wheat and eyes as blue as a summer sky, Winifred felt her breath catch. "Mrs. Bauer." His voice was deep, roughened by the elements. "Miss," she corrected softly. "I'm Winifred Bauer." His gaze moved from her face, taking in the fading bruises she couldn't hide to the bundle in her arms. Something flickered across his features, too quick for her to identify. "I'm Ethan Blackburn." He stepped closer, and Winifred instinctively drew back. He paused, noting her reaction, and deliberately softened his stance. "Your letters didn't mention a child." Winifred swallowed hard, chin lifting despite her fear. "I understand if you wish to void our arrangement. I can. Is it a boy or a girl?" he interrupted, his expression unreadable. "A girl," Winifred whispered. "Emma. She's 4 months old." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, studying them both. Then he reached for her carpetbag with one hand while extending the other toward her elbow, careful not to touch her until she gave a small nod of permission. "You're both mine now," he said simply, guiding her toward a wagon parked nearby. "Let's get you home before dark. The road to the ranch can be treacherous after nightfall." Winifred blinked rapidly against unexpected tears. She'd prepared herself for rejection, not acceptance, and certainly not the immediate claim of responsibility in his words. As he helped her into the wagon, she wondered what kind of man would so readily take on another man's child, and a battered woman he'd never met. The baby stirred again as they settled, tiny fists waving in the air. Ethan looked down at Emma with curiosity rather than resentment, and for the first time in months, Winifred allowed herself to feel the faintest flicker of hope. The wagon creaked as Ethan climbed aboard, taking the reins in hands that looked strong enough to break a man's jaw but gentle enough to handle fragile things with care. "It's a good hour to the ranch," he explained, guiding the horses away from town. If you're hungry, there's bread and cheese in that sack behind you. Thank you, Mr. Blackburn, but Ethan, he corrected. We're to be married after all. The directness of his statement caught her off guard. About that, she began hesitantly, I should explain about Emma and these. She gestured vaguely to her bruises. No need to explain anything you don't want to, he said, eyes fixed on the road ahead. Whatever happened before is past. Here you start fresh. They rode in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the occasional snuffle from Emma. Winifred studied Ethan's profile surreptitiously. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of squinting against the sun. His hands were calloused, his forearms tanned and corded with muscle where his sleeves were rolled up. How big is your ranch? She asked finally, desperate to break the silence. 800 acres, give or take, 30 head of cattle, some horses. It's not the biggest spread in Nebraska, but it's mine, free and clear. And you manage it alone. A smile quirked the corner of his mouth. I've got a hand who helps with the cattle. Josiah. Good man, though he talks too much. And Mrs. Graves comes from town twice a week to help with cooking and washing. Winifred nodded, wondering what role she would play in this new household. I'm a good cook, she offered, and I can sew. I worked as a seamstress in Chicago. Ethan glanced at her, something like approval warming his eyes. That'll be useful. Winter's coming and mending needs doing. The road began to climb, winding through rolling grasslands dotted with cottonwood trees. In the distance, Winifred could make out a low structure nestled against a hillside. That's it, Ethan said, following her gaze. Home. The ranch house was modest but solid, built of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney. A large barn stood nearby, along with several smaller outbuildings. As they approached, Winifred saw a vegetable garden, a chicken coop, and a corral where several horses grazed. It wasn't grand, but it looked peaceful, secure. Ethan brought the wagon to a stop in front of the house. Wait here, he said, jumping down. Before Winifred could protest, he'd circled around and was reaching up to help her down, careful not to disturb the baby. Thank you, she murmured, suddenly shy as his hands briefly encircled her waist. He nodded, retrieving her carpetbag before leading her to the door. Inside, the house was surprisingly welcoming. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with chairs, and a comfortable-looking armchair. There were shelves with books, actual books, and curtains at the windows. It's not much, Ethan said, watching her reaction, but it's warm in winter and cool in summer. It's lovely, Winifred replied honestly. He showed her to a small bedroom off the main room. You and Emma can sleep here. A larger room across the narrow hallway was obviously his, with a bigger bed and a chest at its foot. Where will you sleep? She asked, confused. The barn for now, he answered simply. Until after the wedding. His straightforwardness brought heat to her cheeks. About that, she began again. We don't need to rush, Ethan interrupted. The preacher comes through town every third Sunday. That's 10 days from now. Gives you time to settle in, make sure this is what you want. The consideration in his words nearly undid her. Mr. Blackburn, Ethan, I need to be honest with you. Emma isn't mine, not by birth. His eyebrows rose slightly, but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. She belonged to my sister, Abigail. She died in childbirth. Winifred swallowed hard against the grief that still felt raw. Her husband blamed Emma for Abigail's death. He wasn't a kind man. When I found him raising his hand to Emma, I took her and ran. Understanding dawned in Ethan's eyes as he looked at her bruises with new comprehension. He did that to you. Winifred nodded, unable to meet his gaze. He was drunk. Said if I wanted the brat so badly, I could have a taste of what she deserved. I grabbed Emma and left that night. I didn't know where to go until I saw your advertisement in the paper." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "This man, he know where you've gone?" "No, I left no trail," he nodded, seeming satisfied. "Good, you're safe here, Winifred, both of you." He hesitated, then added, "I lost my sister too. Different circumstances, but I understand what it means to protect what family you have left." Something unspoken passed between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of shared grief and determination. Emma began to fuss, breaking the moment. "She's probably hungry," Winifred said. "I should feed her." "I'll give you privacy," Ethan replied, heading for the door. "There's a pump out back for fresh water, and I'll bring in wood for the stove. Mrs. Graves left stew, I'll heat it up for dinner." When he'd gone, Winifred sank onto the edge of the bed, Emma cradled against her chest. She'd prepared herself for so many scenarios: rejection, grudging acceptance, even cruelty. Ethan's quiet decency had caught her completely off guard. "I think we might be okay here, Emma," she whispered to the baby as she prepared to feed her. "I really think we might." By the time Winifred emerged from the bedroom, Ethan had a fire crackling in the stove, and the rich smell of beef stew filled the small house. He'd set the table with 2 mismatched plates and cups that had clearly seen better days. "It's not fancy," he said, noticing her looking at the worn dishes, "but Mrs. Graves says my bachelor ways are shameful. Been meaning to get proper things." "These are perfectly fine," Winifred assured him. "I can make curtains for the windows too if you'd like. And perhaps cushions for the chairs." A smile ghosted across his face. "Already planning to make changes, are you?" "Oh, I didn't mean to overstep, I'm teasing," he interrupted gently. "House could use a woman's touch, always meant for someone else to be here." The simple honesty in his voice touched her. He hadn't built this home just for himself. He'd built it with the hope of family. Winifred wondered what had kept him alone until now, why he'd resorted to advertising for a wife. They ate in companionable silence, broken only by Emma's occasional coos from the blanket Winifred had spread on the floor beside her chair. After dinner, Ethan insisted on washing the dishes while Winifred tended to the baby. "I'll show you around the ranch properly tomorrow," he said as he dried his hands. "Best get some rest now. You've had a long journey." Winifred nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she truly was. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything." He paused at the door, hat in hand. "Nothing to thank me for." "Sleep well, Winifred." After he'd gone, Winifred settled Emma in a drawer she'd padded with blankets, a makeshift crib. The baby fell asleep almost immediately, tiny fists relaxed on either side of her head. Winifred watched her for a long moment before preparing for bed herself. As she slipped beneath the covers, she realized she hadn't felt afraid since arriving at the ranch. For the first time in months, she fell asleep without fear of what the morning might bring. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet movement in the kitchen. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then Emma stirred in her makeshift bed, and the events of the previous day came flooding back. Dressing quickly, Winifred checked on Emma, who was still sleeping peacefully, before venturing into the main room. Ethan stood at the stove, his back to her, broad shoulders flexing beneath his shirt as he stirred something in a pan. "Good morning," she said softly. He turned, and the smile that lit his face transformed him from merely handsome to breathtaking. "Morning. Hope I didn't wake you." "No, I usually rise early." She moved to check on Emma. "I'm surprised she's still sleeping. Journey probably tired her out." Ethan gestured to the stove. "Breakfast's almost ready. Nothing fancy, just eggs and bacon. There's coffee too." Winifred poured herself a cup, savoring the rich aroma. This is wonderful. In Chicago, I could rarely afford good coffee. One of the few luxuries I don't skimp on, Ethan admitted. Used to drink the stuff cowboys make on the trail, thick enough to stand a spoon in it. Never again if I can help it. The casual comment opened a window into his past. You were a trail rider for a few years after the war. He dished eggs onto plates, avoiding her eyes. Drove cattle up from Texas to the railheads in Kansas. The war, she prompted gently, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Joined up in '63 when I was 18. Served until Appomattox. Union Army then. Winifred nodded, understanding his reticence. Many veterans preferred not to speak of those dark years. How did you end up in Nebraska? She asked, changing the subject. The tension eased from his shoulders. Won this land in a poker game in '71. Fella thought he was cheating me with a worthless patch of dirt. Turns out, it's got some of the best grazing land in the territory and a year-round spring. Winifred laughed, delighted by the story. So you're not just a rancher but a lucky gambler too. Haven't played cards since, Ethan replied with a wink. Figured I'd used up all my luck in one hand. Emma's cry interrupted their conversation. Winifred moved to get her, but Ethan was already heading toward the bedroom. May I? He asked, pausing at the door. Surprised, Winifred nodded. She watched as Ethan gently lifted Emma from her drawer bed, his large hands careful and sure as they cradled the small body. "Good morning, little lady," he murmured, and the tenderness in his voice made Winifred's heart twist strangely in her chest. Emma stopped crying immediately, staring up at Ethan with wide, curious eyes. A tiny hand reached up, grasping at his beard. "She likes you," Winifred said, moving closer. "She's got good taste," Ethan replied with a straight face that made Winifred laugh again. After breakfast, true to his word, Ethan showed Winifred around the ranch. Emma secured in a sling across Winifred's chest, they walked the property, Ethan pointing out the boundaries, the best grazing areas, the spring that never ran dry. "Land slopes down to that creek," he explained, pointing to a line of trees in the distance. "Good fishing there. And those hills to the north shelter us from the worst of the winter winds." Winifred tried to take it all in, this place that might become her home. It was beautiful in a rugged, expansive way so different from Chicago's crowded streets. They visited the barn, where Ethan introduced her to the horses, 4 sturdy working animals and 1 spirited mare he was particularly proud of. "Duchess," he said, stroking the mare's glossy neck. "Best cutting horse in 3 counties. "She's beautiful," Winifred agreed, admiring the sleek animal. "She's yours if you want her," Ethan said casually. "Once you learn to ride." Winifred stared at him in shock. "I couldn't possibly. Everyone on a ranch needs their own horse," he interrupted. "She's gentle under the right hands." Before Winifred could respond, a cheerful voice called from outside the barn. "Ethan, you hiding from work again?" A tall, lanky man appeared in the doorway, his dark face creased in a wide smile that faltered slightly when he noticed Winifred. "Josiah," Ethan said, "meet Miss Winifred Bauer, my fiancée." The slight hesitation before the word wasn't lost on Winifred, but Josiah recovered quickly, removing his hat with a flourish. "Miss Bauer. Well now, the boss has been keeping secrets." He shot Ethan a mock, accusing look before turning back to Winifred with a warm smile. "Welcome to Blackburn Ranch." "Thank you," Winifred replied, liking him immediately. "And this is Emma." Josiah peered at the baby with undisguised delight. "Aren't you just the prettiest little thing this side of the Missouri?" He looked up at Ethan with raised eyebrows, clearly curious about the child's presence but too polite to ask directly. "Emma is Winifred's niece," Ethan explained simply. "They're a package deal." Josiah nodded, accepting this without further question. Well, any friend of Miss Winifred's is a friend of mine, even the tiny ones. Their easy acceptance of Emma treating her presence as unremarkable rather than scandalous touched Winifred deeply. In Chicago, unmarried women with babies were objects of scorn and gossip. Here, it seemed, people's business was their own. After Josiah left to tend to the cattle, Ethan showed Winifred the chicken coop and vegetable garden, explaining what grew well in the Nebraska soil and what struggled. Mrs. Graves has been keeping the garden going, he said, but she says at her age, bending over to pull weeds is getting harder. I'd be happy to take over the gardening, Winifred offered. I've never had space for one before, but I understand the principles. Ethan nodded, pleased. Good. Between that and the chickens, we're nearly self-sufficient for food. Slaughter a steer before winter, hunt some game when needed, and we rarely need to buy provisions except for flour, sugar, and coffee. The casual we didn't escape Winifred's notice. Ethan spoke as if her place here was already settled, as if there was no question that she would stay. It was presumptuous, perhaps, but also reassuring in its certainty. By midday, Emma was fussing from hunger and overstimulation, and Winifred was feeling the effects of her long journey. Enough for today, Ethan declared, noticing her fatigue. Let's get you both back to the house. As they walked back, Winifred marveled at how comfortable she already felt in Ethan's presence. There was something steadying about him, a quiet confidence that put her at ease despite the newness of their situation. At the house, he surprised her again by producing a small wooden cradle from the barn. Made it last night, he explained, setting it in her bedroom. Figured that drawer wouldn't do for long. Winifred stared at the cradle, speechless. It was beautifully crafted with smooth edges and gentle curves. He'd even carved small stars along the sides. You made this. In one night, Ethan shrugged, suddenly looking self-conscious. Had the wood already, just needed shaping. It's beautiful, Winifred whispered, running her fingers over the polished surface. Thank you, Ethan. Their eyes met, and something warm and undefined passed between them. Ethan cleared his throat first, breaking the moment. I'll leave you to rest, he said, backing toward the door. Got work to do with Josiah. If you need anything, just ring that bell by the door. I'll hear it from the pastures. When he'd gone, Winifred placed Emma in her new cradle, watching as the baby's eyes grew heavy with sleep. He's a good man, isn't he? She whispered, more to herself than to Emma. The question that followed remained unspoken. Could he possibly be as good as he seemed? The next few days fell into a surprisingly comfortable rhythm. Ethan rose before dawn, bringing in firewood and heating water before heading out to work with the cattle. Winifred would wake to find coffee already brewed, take care of Emma, then spend her mornings exploring the house and immediate surroundings. She discovered a trunk in the attic filled with fabric scraps, remnants of curtains and clothes long past use, but perfect for quilting. When Ethan returned for the midday meal, she showed him her find. Those were my mother's, he said, a shadow crossing his face. She was always making something. I'm sorry, Winifred said quickly. I shouldn't have gone through your things. No, it's fine. He touched a scrap of faded blue calico. She'd be glad someone was putting them to use. She died when I was 16, influenza. And your father never came back from the war. Confederate prison camp. His voice was matter-of-fact, but Winifred could see the old pain beneath the words. My parents died in the Chicago fire, she offered in return. Abigail and I were staying with a friend that night. We lost everything. Ethan nodded, understanding in his eyes. They were both orphans of a nation's recent tragedies, the war, the fire. Loss had shaped them both. Make whatever you want from those scraps, he said finally. Consider them yours now. That evening, Mrs. Graves arrived for her twice-weekly visit. She was a formidable woman in her 60s, with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Winifred braced herself for judgment, but after a moment's startled assessment, Mrs. Graves merely nodded. "About time Ethan found himself a woman," she declared. "Place needs a proper mistress." She eyed the baby with barely disguised curiosity but, like Josiah, asked no direct questions. Instead, she launched into a detailed explanation of where everything in the kitchen was kept, her preferred method for cleaning the stone floors, and which merchants in town could be trusted not to overcharge. "Thomas at the general store will try to sell you last season's flour if you don't check the bags," she warned. "And don't let Miller's boy deliver your purchases. He helps himself to anything sweet." Winifred absorbed it all, grateful for the practical advice and the woman's matter-of-fact acceptance of her presence. When Mrs. Graves finally departed, leaving behind fresh bread and a mountain of clean laundry, Winifred felt she'd passed some sort of test. "She likes you," Ethan commented as they watched the older woman's wagon disappear down the track. "Usually she stays half as long and talks twice as much." Winifred laughed. "Is her approval important in Kearney?" "Absolutely. Mrs. Graves knows everyone's business and has opinions on all of it. If she approves of you, the rest of the town will follow suit." It was the first mention of how the town might receive her, an unmarried woman with a baby, arriving as a mail-order bride. Winifred had been trying not to think about it, but now anxiety crept in. "Will people talk?" she asked quietly. Ethan considered for a moment. "They'll be curious, sure. Not every day a man gets himself a mail-order bride, but once we're married, you'll be Mrs. Blackburn and Emma will be a Blackburn too. That's all that matters." His confidence was reassuring, but Winifred wasn't convinced it would be quite so simple. Still, she appreciated his certainty, the way he drew a protective circle around the three of them against outside judgment. That night, after Emma was settled in her cradle, Winifred sat by the fire working on a quilt from the fabric scraps. Ethan sat nearby in his armchair, reading a well-worn copy of The Last of the Mohicans. The domesticity of the scene struck her suddenly, how natural it felt to be sharing this quiet evening with him, as if they'd known each other for years instead of days. Glancing up, she found him watching her over the top of his book, his blue eyes reflective in the firelight. "What?" she asked, self-conscious. "Just thinking this is nice," he replied simply. "Having someone to share the evenings with." The honesty in his voice warmed her more than the fire. "It is nice," she agreed softly. They fell back into comfortable silence, but something had shifted, a tentative bridge forming between their separate solitudes. The next morning, Winifred woke to find a small box beside her bed. Inside was a silver hairbrush with matching hand mirror, delicately engraved with vines and flowers. A note in Ethan's bold handwriting read, "Found these in town last month. Thought they might be useful." The gift brought unexpected tears to her eyes. It wasn't just the items themselves, though they were beautiful, but the realization that he'd bought them weeks ago, in anticipation of her arrival. Even before he knew her, he'd wanted her to feel welcome. When she emerged from her room, Ethan was at the stove as usual, his back to her. Quietly, she moved to stand beside him, and before she could overthink it, rose on tiptoes to press a kiss to his cheek. "Thank you for the brush and mirror," she said as he turned to her in surprise. "They're lovely." A flush crept up his neck, but his eyes held hers steadily. "You're welcome, Winifred." It was the first time she'd initiated physical contact between them, and the moment hung suspended, fraught with possibility. Then Emma cried from the bedroom, breaking the spell. "I should," Winifred gestured toward the sound. "Of course." Ethan stepped back, giving her space to pass. But something had changed. A door had opened between them, if only a crack. The days slipped by, each one adding another thread to the fabric of their emerging life together. Winifred took over the garden, surprised to find she enjoyed the work, the feel of soil between her fingers, the satisfaction of nurturing growing things. Ethan taught her to collect eggs from the chicken coop without frightening the hens, and to milk the solitary cow they kept for fresh dairy. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes in comfortable silence. Ethan would tell stories of his cattle driving days, painting vivid pictures of thunderstorms on the open plains and nights beneath stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Winifred shared carefully edited tales of life in Chicago, the bustling markets, the lakefront, the ever-growing cityscape. She avoided mentioning Abigail's husband, Daniel, but sometimes nightmares would wake her, and she'd find herself gasping for breath, certain he'd found them. On one such night, a particularly vivid dream sent her stumbling from her room in panic. Ethan was there in an instant, appearing from the main room where he'd been reading late. Winifred. His voice was sharp with concern as he caught her by the shoulders. "What's wrong?" "He was here," she gasped, still half caught in the dream. "He found us, he took Emma." "No one's here," Ethan assured her, his hands steady on her shoulders. "Just us. Emma's safe in her cradle." Reality slowly reasserted itself as Winifred became aware of his solid presence, the security of his grip. "I'm sorry," she whispered, embarrassed. "It was just a dream." Ethan guided her to the armchair by the fire, which still held a few glowing embers. "Sit. I'll check on Emma, then make you some tea." He disappeared briefly into her room, returning with a nod. "She's sound asleep, didn't stir at all." As he busied himself with the kettle, Winifred watched him, drawing comfort from his calm efficiency. "Does he still frighten you that much?" Ethan asked quietly, setting a steaming cup before her. Winifred stared into the tea, gathering her thoughts. "Not always. But sometimes I remember how he looked that night, like he wasn't even human anymore, like he would have killed us both and felt nothing." Ethan's jaw tightened, but his voice remained gentle. "He can't find you here, Winifred. I promise you that." "I know," she said, though part of her didn't quite believe it. Daniel Sullivan was a determined man, used to getting what he wanted, if he ever discovered where they'd gone. As if reading her thoughts, Ethan knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. "Winifred, look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his, startled by the intensity she found there. No one will ever hurt you or Emma while I'm alive. Do you understand?" The fierce protectiveness in his voice stole her breath. "I understand," she whispered. His thumbs traced gentle circles on the backs of her hands. "Good. Now finish your tea and try to get some rest. Morning will be here soon enough." As he rose to leave, Winifred caught his wrist. "Stay. Just until I finish the tea." He hesitated only a moment before settling into the chair opposite hers. They sat in silence as Winifred sipped her tea, the only sounds the crackling of the rekindled fire and the distant cry of a coyote. When she finally returned to bed, Winifred felt something inside her shifting, like ice breaking up on a river after a long freeze. For the first time since Abigail's death, she wasn't carrying her fear alone. The next day brought a letter from the circuit preacher, confirming he would arrive in Kearney on Sunday as scheduled. Ethan showed it to Winifred over breakfast, his expression carefully neutral. "We can postpone if you're not ready," he offered, "or cancel altogether if you've changed your mind." Winifred studied him across the table, this man who had opened his home to her and Emma without hesitation, who had promised them protection without demanding anything in return. In just a week, he had shown her more kindness than she'd known in years. "I haven't changed my mind," she said softly. "Sunday is fine." Relief flashed across his face before he schooled his features back to calm. Good. That's good. It wasn't love not yet, but it was something solid, something they could build upon. Winifred found herself looking forward to Sunday with unexpected anticipation. The day before the wedding, Ethan announced they needed to go into town for supplies. "Mrs. Graves says we're running low on flour and sugar," he explained, "and I thought you might want to pick out some fabric for a new dress, for tomorrow." The consideration touched her. "I'd like that." They set out after breakfast, Emma secured in her sling. It was Winifred's first trip to Kearney since her arrival, and she found herself growing nervous as they approached the town. How would people react to her? To Emma? The main street was busier than she remembered, with horses tied outside the saloon and wagons parked in front of the general store. As Ethan helped her down from their wagon, she felt curious eyes upon them. "Mrs. Blackburn." A booming voice called, and Winifred turned to see a portly man with an impressive mustache hurrying toward them. "Not yet, Mayor," Ethan corrected with a smile. "The wedding's tomorrow. This is Miss Winifred Bauer." The mayor swept off his hat, bowing slightly. "My apologies, Miss Bauer." "Welcome to Kearney. I'm Edward Wilson, mayor of this fine establishment." "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Wilson," Winifred replied, relaxing slightly at his friendly manner. "And who's this little one?" he asked, peering at Emma. Before Winifred could answer, Ethan stepped closer, his hand coming to rest lightly on the small of her back. "This is Emma, our daughter." The simple declaration "our daughter" stole Winifred's breath. She glanced up at Ethan in surprise, but his expression gave nothing away as he continued the introductions. Word of their presence spread quickly through the small town. As they made their way to the general store, Winifred was introduced to what felt like half of Kearney's population. Each time, Ethan presented Emma as "our daughter," his tone matter-of-fact, brooking no questions. By the time they reached the store, Winifred was overwhelmed by the attention but grateful for Ethan's protective presence. Inside, the shopkeeper's wife, Mrs. Thomas, immediately took Winifred under her wing. "You'll be wanting fabric for a wedding dress," she declared, pulling bolts of cloth from the shelves. "I've got some lovely cream-colored muslin just came in last month, or this blue would complement your eyes beautifully." Winifred fingered the fabrics, suddenly emotional. She hadn't expected to have a proper wedding dress. Her previous marriage, the one she rarely spoke of, had been a hurried affair at the courthouse with no celebration. "The blue is beautiful," she admitted. Mrs. Thomas beamed. "Blue it is. I'll have my girl deliver it this afternoon, along with thread and notions. You'll need to work quickly to have it ready for tomorrow." While the women discussed fabric, Ethan gathered the supplies they needed. Adding several items, Winifred hadn't requested ribbons for Emma's hair, a small box of peppermint candies, and a book of children's tales with colorful illustrations. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Thomas pulled Winifred aside. "You've got a good man there," she said quietly. "Ethan Blackburn's one of the finest in these parts. Never heard him raise his voice in anger, never seen him turn away someone in need." "I'm beginning to see that," Winifred replied, watching as Ethan loaded their purchases into the wagon. The older woman patted her hand. "And he looks at you like you hung the moon. Don't think I haven't noticed." Winifred felt her cheeks warm. "We barely know each other." "Sometimes that doesn't matter," Mrs. Thomas said with a knowing smile. "The heart recognizes what the head hasn't figured out yet." The words stayed with Winifred as they drove back to the ranch. Did Ethan look at her that way? And more importantly, what did it mean that her own heart quickened whenever he was near? That evening, after Emma was asleep, Winifred worked on her wedding dress by lamplight. The blue fabric Mrs. Thomas had recommended was indeed beautiful, flowing like water through her fingers as she cut and stitched. Ethan sat nearby, ostensibly reading, but she could feel his gaze on her occasionally. Finally, he set his book aside. "There's something I need to ask you," he said, his voice unusually serious. Winifred set down her sewing, giving him her full attention. "What is it?" "Today in town, I referred to Emma as our daughter." He paused, searching for words. "I hope that didn't make you uncomfortable." "I thought it would be simpler than explanations, especially with the wedding tomorrow." "It didn't make me uncomfortable," Winifred assured him. "It was nice, actually, the way you said it." Relief softened his features. "Good, because I meant it, Winifred. If you'll have me as your husband, I'd like to be Emma's father in every way that matters." The simple sincerity in his voice brought tears to Winifred's eyes. "Why?" she asked before she could stop herself. "Why would you do that for a child who isn't yours?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, his gaze turned inward. "When I was 12, my father went to war. Before he left, he told me I was the man of the house now, responsible for my mother and sister." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "I took that seriously, protected them as best I could. But I couldn't protect them from illness. My sister died of scarlet fever while my father was away, my mother from influenza a few years later." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "When I saw you step off that stage coach with Emma in your arms and those bruises on your face, something in me just knew. This was my chance to protect someone again, to do right by a woman and child who needed help." "Out of duty," Winifred said softly, trying to understand. "At first, maybe," Ethan admitted, "but not anymore." He hesitated, then reached across to take her hand. "I'm not good with fancy words, Winifred, but I want you to know that marrying you tomorrow isn't just about duty or doing what's right. It's because in this short time, you and Emma have become important to me, more important than I expected." The confession hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Winifred looked down at their joined hands, his large and calloused, hers smaller but no less marked by work. "You've become important to me too," she whispered, finally giving voice to the feeling that had been growing within her. "Both of us." Something shifted in Ethan's expression, relief, joy, she couldn't quite name it. He squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. "It's late," he said. "You should get some rest before tomorrow." As she gathered her sewing, Winifred felt a strange combination of nervousness and anticipation. Tomorrow, she would become Ethan's wife not just on paper, but in truth. The thought was both frightening and exhilarating. In her room, she laid out the half-finished dress, smoothing the fabric with careful hands. It wasn't the wedding she'd dreamed of as a girl, but somehow it felt more right than anything that had come before. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright. Winifred woke early, finishing the final stitches on her dress before Emma stirred. The blue fabric shimmered in the early light, simple but elegant with its fitted bodice and flowing skirt. After feeding and changing Emma, she laid the baby back in her cradle and began her own preparations. She washed with the rose-scented soap Mrs. Graves had left, brushed her hair until it shone, and pinned it up with trembling fingers. The dress fit perfectly, emphasizing her slender waist and bringing out the blue of her eyes. Looking in the small mirror Ethan had given her, Winifred barely recognized herself. The bruises had faded almost completely, and there was color in her cheeks, a brightness in her eyes that had been missing for too long. A knock at the door startled her. "Winifred," Ethan called. "The preacher's here. Are you ready?" She opened the door to find him standing there in what was clearly his best shirt, hair neatly combed, face freshly shaved. He stared at her for a long moment, something like awe in his expression. "You look beautiful," he said finally. "Thank you." She smoothed the skirt nervously. "You look very handsome yourself." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Josiah made me wash behind my ears. The simple joke broke the tension, making Winifred laugh. She retrieved Emma, who was dressed in a clean gown with a ribbon in her sparse hair, and followed Ethan to the main room. The circuit preacher was a thin man with kind eyes and a gentle manner. Josiah stood beside him, grinning broadly, and to Winifred's surprise, Mrs. Graves and the Thomases from the general store were also present. "Hope you don't mind the audience," Ethan said quietly. "News travels fast in Kearney." "I don't mind," Winifred replied, touched that these people had come to witness their union. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. They stood before the preacher, hands joined, as he spoke of commitment, partnership, and the building of a life together. When it came time for the vows, Ethan's voice was steady, his eyes never leaving Winifred's face as he promised to love, honor, and protect her all the days of his life. Winifred's own voice trembled slightly as she repeated the words, but her heart was sure. This man, this kind, honorable man, was someone she could build a life with, someone she could trust with her safety and Emma's future. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Nebraska," the preacher concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. Blackburn, you may kiss your bride." Ethan hesitated, his eyes asking a silent question. Winifred nodded, and he leaned forward, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was gentle yet promising a beginning rather than a conclusion. When they parted, Mrs. Graves was wiping tears from her eyes, and Josiah was whistling cheerfully. Emma, caught between them, gurgled happily as if she too approved of the union. "Ladies and gentlemen," the preacher announced, "may I present Mr. and Mrs. Ethan Blackburn." The small gathering applauded, and Mrs. Thomas produced a cake she'd baked for the occasion. There was coffee, and even a bottle of whiskey that Josiah passed around for toasts. It was a simple celebration, but joyous in its unpretentiousness. As the afternoon wore on, their guests gradually departed, leaving Ethan and Winifred alone with Emma. A new awareness hung in the air between them. They were truly husband and wife now, with all that entailed. "I'll take my things from the barn," Ethan said finally, breaking the silence. "Unless you'd prefer I stay there a while longer." Winifred gathered her courage. "No. You should bring your things inside. This is your home." Relief flickered across his face. "Our home now." That evening, after Emma was settled for the night, they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the Nebraska sky in shades of gold and crimson. Ethan's arm rested lightly across Winifred's shoulders, and she leaned into his warmth, feeling a contentment she'd thought lost forever. "Mrs. Blackburn," he said softly, testing the name. "Yes, Mr. Blackburn," she replied, smiling up at him. His free hand came up to touch her cheek. "I meant what I said in those vows, every word." "So did I," Winifred whispered. This time when he kissed her, there was nothing hesitant about it. His lips claimed hers with gentle possession, and Winifred responded in kind, her arms circling his neck as she surrendered to the feelings she'd been holding at bay. When they finally parted, both breathless, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected this," he admitted. "When I sent that advertisement, I hoped for companionship, someone to share the work and the days. I never thought I'd find someone like you." "And I never thought I'd find someone like you," Winifred replied honestly. "Someone who would accept Emma and me without question, who would protect us without trying to own us." Ethan brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch reverent. "You're not possessions, Winifred. You're my family." The simple declaration melted something inside her, the last barrier of fear and doubt. When he stood and offered his hand, she took it without hesitation, allowing him to lead her inside, to the bedroom that was now theirs to share. Later, As moonlight spilled through the window and Ethan slept beside her, Winifred reflected on the strange path that had brought her to this moment. She had fled Chicago in desperation, seeking only safety. Instead, she had found a home, a protector, and perhaps in time, love. The thought was still forming in her mind as she drifted into sleep, secure in the knowledge that whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it with Ethan at her side. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt increasingly like home. Each day brought new discoveries, Ethan learning how to soothe Emma when she was fussy, Winifred discovering her skill with the vegetable garden, both of them navigating the delicate dance of a new marriage built more on respect than passion, though that aspect was growing too. The first true test of their union came a month after the wedding, when a letter arrived addressed to Winifred. The Chicago postmark made her hands tremble as she opened it. "It's from my friend Mary," she said, relief flooding her voice as she scanned the contents. "She says Daniel's been looking for us. He's been to her house twice, demanding to know where I took his daughter." Ethan's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Does Mary know where you are?" "No, I only told her I was heading west." Winifred bit her lip, anxiety returning. "But if he's still looking after all this time?" "He won't find you here," Ethan assured her, but his expression had grown grim. "Just the same, I think it's time we make things official with Emma." "Official? Adoption papers." He took her hand, his gaze steady. "If you're willing. Make her legally a Blackburn so no one can ever question who she belongs to." The gesture, so practical yet so profound in its commitment, brought tears to Winifred's eyes. "You do that?" In a heartbeat. Ethan squeezed her hand. "I meant what I said. You're both mine now, in every way that matters." The next day, they rode into Kearney to speak with the county clerk. The process was surprisingly straightforward, with Winifred as Emma's legal guardian and no father listed on the birth certificate. The clerk saw no reason to deny their petition. "I'll file these today," he assured them, stamping the documents with an official seal. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Blackburn. You have a daughter." As they left the courthouse, Winifred felt as if a weight had been lifted. Emma was safely theirs now, protected by law as well as love. "Thank you," she said quietly as they walked back to the wagon, Emma sleeping against her shoulder. Ethan glanced down at her, eyebrows raised. "For what?" "For making us feel safe. For making us a family." A smile softened his features as he leaned down to press a kiss to her forehead. "You've given me just as much, Winifred. Maybe more." The autumn months brought a flurry of activity to the ranch. There was harvesting to be done, cattle to be sorted and sold, winter preparations to make. Winifred threw herself into the work, learning from Ethan and Josiah, determined to be a true partner in their shared enterprise. Emma grew stronger daily, her baby babble beginning to form recognizable sounds. "Pa-pa" was her first clear word, directed unmistakably at Ethan as he lifted her high above his head one evening. The look of stunned joy on his face had moved Winifred to tears. "She knows," he'd whispered, cradling Emma against his chest. "She really knows I'm her father." By the time the first snow fell, transforming the Nebraska landscape into a pristine white expanse, Winifred had come to love the ranch almost as much as she loved the man who had brought her there. The wide open spaces that had once seemed intimidating now felt like freedom. The isolation that had worried her now seemed like blessed privacy. On Christmas morning, Ethan surprised her with a small velvet box. Inside was a gold locket, simple but elegant. "Open it," he urged. The locket contained a tiny photograph of Emma on one side and, to her surprise, a lock of Abigail's hair on the other. "How did you?" "You had it in your carpet bag," Ethan explained. "I saw it when you were unpacking. Thought you might want to keep your sister close to your heart." The thoughtfulness of the gift, recognizing that her love for Abigail remained an important part of who she was, overwhelmed Winifred. She threw her arms around his neck, pressing her face against his shoulder. "It's perfect," she whispered. "You're perfect." He chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Far from it, Mrs. Blackburn, but I'm trying." Winifred's own gift to him was more practical, a new leather-bound journal to replace the tattered one in which he kept the ranch accounts, but she'd inscribed the inside cover with words that made his eyes grow suspiciously bright. "To Ethan, who gave us a home when we needed it most. With all my heart, Winifred." That night, as they lay together in the warmth of their bed while winter winds howled outside, Winifred finally gave voice to the feeling that had been growing inside her for months. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I think I have almost from the beginning." Ethan's arms tightened around her. "I've been waiting to hear those words," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "Been feeling them myself for longer than I care to admit. Why didn't you say something?" "Wanted to be sure you were ready to hear it, that it wasn't just gratitude or obligation making you stay." Winifred propped herself up on one elbow, finding his face in the moonlight that spilled through the window. "It's neither of those things, Ethan. It's you, who you are, how you treat Emma and me, the man you've shown yourself to be every day since we arrived." He pulled her down for a kiss that left no doubt of his own feelings. "I love you, Winifred Blackburn. Have since you stepped off that stagecoach looking like you might break if someone spoke too harshly, but with your chin up anyway, ready to fight the whole world for that baby in your arms." The simple poetry of his words moved her deeply. This man, who claimed not to be good with words, had just captured the essence of who she was in a single sentence. Winter gave way to spring, bringing new calves to the herd and fresh growth to the garden. Emma took her first tottering steps across the cabin floor, falling into Ethan's waiting arms with peals of laughter. Life was good, better than Winifred had ever dared to hope. The nightmares came less frequently now, and when they did, Ethan was there to hold her until the fear subsided. Then, on a mild May morning, the past Winifred had been running from finally caught up with her. She was in the garden, Emma playing nearby on a blanket, when the sound of an approaching horse drew her attention. Visitors were rare at the ranch, especially unannounced ones. Straightening, she shaded her eyes against the sun, trying to make out the rider. Something about the set of his shoulders sent a chill through her even before she could see his face. When he drew closer, her worst fears were confirmed. Daniel Sullivan sat astride a fine bay horse, his face set in the cold mask she remembered all too well. "Hello, Winnie," he called, using the nickname she'd always hated. "Been a long time." Instinctively, Winifred moved to stand between Daniel and Emma. "How did you find me?" He dismounted, tying his horse to the garden fence. "Wasn't easy, but I have friends in the railroad office. One of them remembered a young woman with a baby buying a ticket to Nebraska. From there, it was just a matter of asking around until I found someone who remembered a mail-order bride arriving in Kearney." His gaze shifted to Emma, who was watching the stranger with curious eyes. "She's gotten big." "She's not yours," Winifred said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Not anymore." Daniel's expression hardened. "She's my blood, my daughter. I've come to take her home where she belongs." "This is her home," Winifred countered, her hand moving to the pocket of her apron where she kept a small knife for gardening. "She belongs here with her family." "Family?" Daniel sneered. "You mean that cowboy you've been playing house with? He's nothing to her, nothing to either of you." "He's her father in every way that matters," Winifred replied, raising her chin. "And my husband, legally and in truth." Something dangerous flickered in Daniel's eyes. "Well, that's easily remedied. Widows can't keep children from their real fathers." The threat sent ice through Winifred's veins. She glanced toward the pastures, praying Ethan would return soon. He and Josiah had ridden out at dawn to check the north fences, but they usually returned by midday. "You should leave, Daniel," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "There's nothing for you here." He took a step toward her, and Winifred tensed, the knife half drawn from her pocket. But before Daniel could come closer, the sound of galloping hooves drew their attention. Ethan rode into the yard at full speed, reining his horse to a sharp halt before swinging down from the saddle. His expression was thunderous as he strode toward them. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. "And what are you doing on my property?" Daniel straightened, his hand moving casually toward his hip where Winifred knew he carried a pistol. "I'm Daniel Sullivan. I've come for my daughter." Ethan's gaze flicked to Winifred and Emma, assessing their safety before returning to Daniel. "Your daughter." His voice was dangerously soft. "Funny, the papers I have say she's mine." "Papers can be changed," Daniel replied with a cold smile. "Or burned. Accidents happen out here in the wilderness." The barely veiled threat hung in the air between them. Winifred held her breath, terrified of what might happen next. Both men were armed, both determined, and Emma was caught in the middle. "Winifred," Ethan said without taking his eyes off Daniel, "take Emma inside." "But now, please." His voice was gentle but firm. Gathering Emma in her arms, Winifred backed toward the house, her heart hammering in her chest. From the porch, she could still hear their voices, though not the exact words. Whatever Ethan said made Daniel's posture stiffen, his hand moving more deliberately toward his gun. She couldn't leave Ethan to face this alone. Setting Emma down inside the doorway with a whispered instruction to stay put, Winifred reached for the rifle Ethan kept mounted above the mantel. By the time she returned to the porch, the confrontation had escalated. Daniel's gun was drawn, pointed at Ethan's chest. "I'm not leaving without her," Daniel was saying, his voice tight with anger. "She's mine by blood, and no rancher playing at being a father is going to keep her from me." "She stopped being yours the moment you raised your hand to her," Ethan replied, his own hand hovering near his holster. "A real father protects his child, loves her. You don't deserve to speak her name." Daniel's finger tightened on the trigger. "Last chance, Cowboy. Step aside or die where you stand." Without hesitation, Winifred raised the rifle to her shoulder. "Daniel," she called, her voice ringing clear across the yard. Both men turned, surprised by her interruption. "Put the gun down," she ordered, the rifle steady in her hands. "I won't let you hurt anyone else I love." Daniel's eyes narrowed, assessing the threat. "You won't shoot me, Winnie. You don't have it in you." "I didn't," she agreed, "before Emma, before Ethan, but for them, there's nothing I wouldn't do." Something in her voice, the absolute certainty, perhaps gave Daniel pause. His gaze moved from Winifred to Ethan and back again. "This isn't over," he said finally, lowering his gun slightly. "I'll be back with the law on my side." "The law is already decided," Ethan replied. "Emma is our daughter legally, adopted with the full approval of the county court. You have no claim to her." Doubt flickered across Daniel's face for the first time. "You're lying." "The papers are inside," Winifred said. "Signed, sealed, and filed with the county clerk. You can see them yourself if you don't believe us." Daniel hesitated, clearly reassessing his position. After a long moment, he holstered his gun. "This isn't the last you'll hear from me," he warned, backing toward his horse. "Blood counts for something, even out here in this God-forsaken territory." "Not as much as love," Ethan countered. "Not as much as being there every day, caring for her, protecting her. That's what makes a father, Sullivan, not blood." Daniel mounted his horse, his face a mask of cold fury. "We'll see what the courts say about that." As he rode away, Winifred lowered the rifle, her hands suddenly shaking as the adrenaline drained from her body. Ethan was at her side in an instant, taking the weapon and setting it aside before pulling her into his arms. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. "Did he hurt you?" "No," she assured him, clinging to the solid warmth of his chest. "We're fine. But Ethan, if he comes back, he won't get near either of you," Ethan promised. "But just to be safe, we'll ride into town tomorrow, speak with the sheriff. Make sure everyone knows Sullivan has no legal claim to Emma." Inside, they found Emma playing contentedly with her wooden blocks, oblivious to the danger that had just passed. Watching her, Winifred felt a renewed surge of protectiveness. "I meant what I said," she told Ethan quietly. "I would have shot him if I had to." Ethan nodded, no judgment in his eyes. "I know. So would I." That night, after Emma was asleep, they sat at the kitchen table discussing what to do next. Ethan had already sent Josiah to alert the sheriff about Daniel's visit, but they needed a longer-term plan. "He won't give up easily," Winifred warned. "Daniel's always been stubborn and he hates to lose." "But he doesn't actually want Emma," Ethan pointed out. "He just doesn't want you to have her. Men like that, it's about control, not love." Winifred nodded, recognizing the truth in his words. "What can we do?" Ethan reached across the table to take her hand. "We fight, together. Show the world and any judge who asks that Emma belongs with us, that we're her parents in every way that matters." His conviction steadied her. "Together," she agreed, squeezing his hand. The next morning they rode into Kearney, Emma secured between them. The sheriff, a weathered man named Cooper, listened gravely to their story. "I'll keep an eye out for this Sullivan character," he promised. "And I'll telegraph the county judge. Let him know about the situation in case Sullivan tries to file a claim." "Thank you, Sheriff," Ethan said, relief evident in his voice. As they left the sheriff's office, Winifred spotted a familiar face across the street, Daniel, emerging from the saloon. He caught sight of them at the same moment, his eyes narrowing before he turned abruptly and walked away. "He's still here," she whispered, clutching Emma tighter. "Let him watch," Ethan replied, his arm coming around her shoulders. "Let him see what a real family looks like." They spent the day in town, deliberately visible. Ethan introduced Winifred and Emma to everyone they encountered, emphasizing their family status. By the time they headed back to the ranch, half of Kearney had heard their story and pledged support. "No stranger's going to come in here and take a child from good folks like you," Mrs. Thomas assured them. "Not while this town has anything to say about it." The show of solidarity was touching, but Winifred remained uneasy. She knew Daniel too well to believe he would simply give up and go home. Her fears proved justified 3 days later when Sheriff Cooper rode out to the ranch, his expression troubled. "Sullivan's filed a petition with the county court," he informed them, claiming the adoption was fraudulent because he wasn't notified or given a chance to object. Winifred's heart sank. "He abandoned us, left us with nothing." "The judge will want to hear that," Cooper replied. "Hearing set for next week in the county seat. You'll both need to testify." After the sheriff departed, Winifred sat heavily at the kitchen table, despair washing over her. What if they give her to him? What if they believe him over us? Ethan knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. "They won't. We have the truth on our side, Winifred, and if that's not enough, we'll find another way. I promise you, Emma stays with us." The determination in his voice steadied her. This was no longer her battle alone. It was theirs together. The day of the hearing dawned clear and bright. They dressed in their best clothes, Winifred in the blue dress she'd worn for their wedding, Emma in a new gown Winifred had sewn specially. Josiah had offered to come with them for moral support, and they gratefully accepted. The county courthouse was a 2-hour ride from Kearney, a substantial brick building that spoke of permanence in a territory still defining itself. Inside, the courtroom was already crowded when they arrived. It seemed half of Kearney had made the journey to show their support. Daniel sat at the front of the room, dressed in an expensive suit that reminded Winifred of his Chicago prosperity. He didn't acknowledge her presence, but she could feel his cold gaze following her as Ethan led her to their seats. The judge, a stern-faced man named Hollister, called the court to order promptly at 10 o'clock. He began by reviewing the adoption papers and Daniel's petition. "This is an unusual case," he remarked, looking over his spectacles at the assembled parties. "Mr. Sullivan claims he was unaware of his daughter's whereabouts and was not given an opportunity to assert his parental rights. Mrs. Blackburn, formerly Bauer, claims Mr. Sullivan abandoned the child and forfeited those rights. We'll hear from both sides, beginning with Mr. Sullivan." Daniel took the stand with the confidence of a man accustomed to being believed. He painted a picture of a grieving widower whose sister-in-law had stolen his daughter in the night, depriving him of his only link to his beloved deceased wife. "I've been searching for them for months," he concluded, his voice breaking convincingly. "Emma is all I have left of my Abigail. I just want my daughter back where she belongs." It was a compelling performance, and Winifred felt sick as she watched several of the spectators nod sympathetically. Even knowing the truth, she could almost believe him herself. When it was her turn to testify, Winifred took a deep breath, drawing strength from Ethan's steady presence beside her. In a clear voice that gained confidence as she spoke, she recounted the truth: Abigail's difficult marriage, Daniel's growing resentment of the baby who had taken his wife, his descent into drunken violence. "I found him standing over Emma's cradle with his hand raised," she said, the memory still vivid. "He was drunk, raging that she'd killed Abigail. When I tried to stop him, he turned on me." She gestured to her face. "The bruises had barely faded when I arrived in Kearney." The judge's expression remained neutral. "And you have witnesses to this alleged violence?" Winifred's heart sank. "No, Your Honor. It happened in our home, behind closed doors." Daniel smiled coldly from his seat, confident in his advantage. Then, to Winifred's surprise, the courtroom door opened and Mrs. Graves entered, supporting a frail-looking woman Winifred didn't recognize. "Begging the court's pardon," Mrs. Graves called, "but there is a witness." The judge frowned at the interruption. "Who are you, madam?" "Margaret Graves, Your Honor. And this is Mary Caldwell, just arrived from Chicago on the morning train. She has testimony relevant to this case." Winifred gasped softly. Mary, her friend from Chicago, the one who'd written about Daniel's search for them. The judge hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. We'll hear what Mrs. Caldwell has to say." Mary was sworn in, her face pale but determined as she took the stand. In a quiet voice that nonetheless carried throughout the courtroom, she described what she had witnessed: Daniel's drunken rages, his neglect of Emma, his threats against both the baby and Winifred. "I saw the bruises," she concluded, looking directly at Daniel. "Not just once, but many times. I begged Winifred to leave before he killed them both. When she finally did, it was the bravest thing I'd ever seen." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Daniel's face had darkened with anger, his carefully constructed facade crumbling under Mary's testimony. "This is absurd," he protested, rising to his feet. "She's lying," clearly coached by the Blackburns. "To Mr. Sullivan," the judge interrupted sharply. "You will control yourself in my courtroom or be removed." Daniel subsided, but the damage was done. His mask of grieving fatherhood had slipped, revealing the anger beneath. Ethan was the last to testify, his quiet dignity a stark contrast to Daniel's outburst. He spoke of finding Winifred and Emma on his doorstep, battered and afraid of their gradual healing in the months since, of his love for the child he considered his daughter in every way that mattered. "Emma knows me as her father," he said simply. "She's happy, healthy, and safe. Isn't that what matters most?" When all testimony had been heard, the judge retired to consider his decision. The waiting was agonizing. Winifred held Emma close, whispering reassurances she wasn't sure she believed herself. Ethan's arm around her shoulders was steady, his presence a bulwark against her fears. "No matter what happens," he promised quietly, "we face it together." Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the judge returned to the bench. The courtroom fell silent as he cleared his throat. "This is not a simple case," he began. "The law generally recognizes the rights of a natural parent over those of adoptive ones. However, the law also exists to protect the innocent, particularly children who cannot protect themselves." He looked directly at Daniel. "Mr. Sullivan, I find the testimony regarding your treatment of the child disturbing. While you may have a biological claim, your actions suggest you are not fit to exercise parental authority." Relief began to wash over Winifred, but the judge wasn't finished. "Mrs. Blackburn, your decision to remove the child from a dangerous situation was understandable, even commendable. However, the proper course would have been to seek legal intervention, not to flee across state lines." Winifred's hope faltered. Was he going to rule against them after all? The judge straightened his papers. "Having considered all testimony and evidence, I find that the best interests of the child, Emma Sullivan Blackburn, are served by remaining in the custody of her adoptive parents, Ethan and Winifred Blackburn." A cheer erupted from the Kearney contingent. Winifred sagged against Ethan in relief, as he pulled her and Emma into a tight embrace. "The adoption will stand," the judge continued over the noise, "with the following condition. Mr. Sullivan will be permitted one supervised visit per year, should he choose to exercise that right, to maintain some connection to his biological child." It wasn't a perfect ruling, but it was a victory nonetheless. Emma would stay with them, safe in the home they had built together. Daniel stormed from the courtroom without looking back, his face a mask of thwarted rage. Winifred watched him go, feeling not triumph but a strange sort of pity. He would never know the joy of Emma's laughter, the wonder of her first steps, the privilege of guiding her life. Outside the courthouse, their friends from Kearney surrounded them with congratulations and well wishes. Mary approached hesitantly, her smile tired but genuine. "I came as soon as I got Mrs. Graves's telegram," she explained. "I couldn't let him take Emma after everything he'd done." Winifred embraced her friend tearfully. "Thank you. I don't know what we would have done without your testimony." "You look happy," Mary observed, studying Winifred's face. "Truly happy." "I am," Winifred confirmed, glancing at Ethan who stood nearby, Emma perched on his shoulders. "I found what I didn't even know I was looking for." The ride back to Kearney was jubilant, with Josiah leading the group in songs of celebration. By the time they reached town, Winifred was exhausted but profoundly grateful. The nightmare was over. Emma was officially and irrevocably theirs. That evening, after the celebrations had died down and they were alone at the ranch once more, Ethan built a fire in the hearth despite the warmth of the summer night. "What's this for?" Winifred asked, settling Emma on a blanket nearby. "Thought we might need it," he replied mysteriously, disappearing into their bedroom. When he returned, he carried a small wooden box. "What's that?" she asked, curious. Ethan set the box on the table between them. "Open it." Inside, Winifred found a collection of papers, her original letters to him, the marriage certificate, Emma's adoption papers, and something new. A deed to the ranch with both their names on it. "Ethan," she breathed, running her fingers over the document. "You didn't have to do this." "Wanted to make it official," he said simply. "Everything I have is yours. Everything I am is yours. Has been since you stepped off that stagecoach." Tears pricked at Winifred's eyes. "I came here looking for safety," she whispered. "I never expected to find love." "Sometimes we find what we need instead of what we're looking for," Ethan replied, drawing her into his arms. "And sometimes they turn out to be the same thing." As they stood together by the fire, Emma playing contentedly at their feet, Winifred reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. She had arrived in Kearney battered and afraid, clutching a baby she had vowed to protect at any cost. In Ethan, she had found not just a protector but a partner, not just safety but joy. "What happens now?" she asked, looking up at him. Ethan smiled, the firelight catching the gold in his hair. "Now we live, Mrs. Blackburn. We raise our daughter, maybe add a few more children to the family. We build something that will last beyond us." "I'd like that," Winifred said softly. "All of it." Outside, the Nebraska night settled over the land they now shared. Inside, the fire crackled, casting its warm glow over the family gathered around it, a family formed not by blood but by choice, by love, by the simple, profound declaration Ethan had made that first day. "You're both mine now." And they were by law, by love, by the unbreakable bonds they had forged together. Whatever the future held, they would face it as they had faced the past, together, stronger for having found each other when they needed it most. 2 years later, on a bright spring morning, Winifred stood on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching Ethan teach Emma to ride her new pony. The little girl, now 3 years old, sat proudly in the small saddle, her father's hand steady on her back as the pony walked in a gentle circle. "Look, Mama," Emma called, waving excitedly. "I'm riding all by myself." "I see you, sweetheart," Winifred called back, smiling at her daughter's enthusiasm. Inside, their 6-month-old son, James, slept peacefully in his cradle, a new cradle Ethan had crafted with the same care he'd put into Emma's years before. He was a quiet baby, solemn-eyed and thoughtful, with his father's blonde hair and his mother's determined chin. Daniel Sullivan had never returned to exercise his visitation rights. According to Mary's last letter, he had remarried and moved to California, apparently content to leave the past behind. Winifred sometimes wondered if Emma would one day have questions about her biological parents, but that was a bridge they would cross when they came to it. For now, she was simply, completely happy as Ethan and Winifred's daughter. The ranch had prospered under their joint care. Ethan's cattle herd had nearly doubled, and Winifred's vegetable garden had expanded into a small but productive farm operation that supplied not only their own needs, but extra produce they sold in town. They had built a new, larger house the previous year, with proper bedrooms for the children and a parlor where Winifred taught Emma her letters in the evenings. Josiah had stayed on, becoming like family over the years. He lived in the old cabin now, claiming it suited him better than quarters in the barn, and had recently started courting the schoolteacher from Kearney. Mrs. Graves still came twice a week, though she did less cleaning now and more spoiling of the children, bringing them sweets and toys she insisted they needed. Life wasn't perfect, there were still hard times, arguments, moments of doubt, but it was rich and full in a way neither Ethan nor Winifred had dared to hope for before finding each other. As Winifred watched her husband and daughter, her hand rested lightly on her still flat stomach. She hadn't told Ethan yet about the new life growing inside her, wanting to choose the perfect moment to share the news. Perhaps tonight, after the children were asleep, She would tell him they would need to prepare the small bedroom next to James's for yet another Blackburn. Emma's delighted laughter rang out across the yard as Ethan lifted her from the pony and swung her high into the air. His own laugh joined hers, deep and joyful, the sound of a man who had found his purpose. Winifred smiled, her heart full to overflowing. From the darkest moments of her life had come this unexpected joy, a husband who loved her, children who thrived under their care, a home built on mutual respect and growing affection. She had arrived in Kearney bruised and terrified, a baby in her arms and little hope in her heart. She had found not just shelter but love, not just safety but belonging. As Ethan carried Emma back toward the house, both of them smiling widely, Winifred stepped forward to meet them, arms open to embrace the family that had begun with two simple, powerful declarations. "You're both mine now," and her own unspoken response, "and you are ours."